One of the most influential pieces of science fiction brought to life on the big screen, full of detail, an intriguing narrative, and the aesthetics to match. Dune is one piece of media that will leave you easily entertained. Welcome to Easily Entertained, a show dedicated to appreciating all the best parts of entertainment. My name's Bryson Olson, and I'm a filmmaker and a lover of all forms of storytelling. Here I will bring you along as we critique and analyze stories with a more positive take on why we enjoy them, and bring a new appreciation to the world of entertainment. Welcome back to Easily Entertained. My name is Bryson Olson, and I'm here to give you all the latest on entertainment. Today we are talking about Dune. I just watched Dune Part 2 yesterday as of recording this, and it was incredible. I thought it was so good. So spoilers for Dune Part 2 if you haven't read the book or haven't seen the second part. But yeah, I thought we would talk about it. We're going to be kind of talking about Dune overall, and this is going to be coming from someone who has never read the books or seen the old movies. I've only seen the new ones with Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya, so that you'll kind of have to bear with me. If you're a super nerd and have read Dune, good for you. I'm just going to be talking about the movie aspects of it and how I think it fits into a visual storytelling medium. And from what I've heard, it kind of fits into that a little bit better. But we'll kind of talk about that a bit more later when we talk about the more visual aspects and just how the movie is made more near the end. But before we get into that, let's talk about the world of Dune. I think what's so great about these movies is that the world is so full of detail. They do not take any shortcuts in explaining how the worlds work, how the economy and ecology and the empire works. They explain everything, and they do it in a way that in the first movie, it's kind of exposition-y, and I kind of noticed that rewatching the first movie, because I watched part 1 and then I watched part 2 like a half hour later. And so what I noticed especially is the first Dune is very exposition-y. They explain a lot about the world and like introduce you to the characters, but don't dive hugely into their story yet. They give you very much that beginning and leave part 2 to do the character development and the actual story of the film. It's very much a kind of spectacle type movie where the movies should be seen together. They're kind of a sequential type of series where it's not each movie stands on their own. It is more of a you should watch these back to back. But I think when you're building such a massive world, especially one that not the general public is going to be very aware of, it is good to build a world and kind of establish what is happening. And I do kind of like that aspect of the two parts, is that the first one is mainly about, okay, let's establish what the world is, while the second one focuses more on the story. And what I do love about the details is, like I said, they get really into it. I love that this series, it takes place like like technically in space on a foreign planet that the main characters are not from, but they kind of explain why they're there. They don't use space as like, yeah, we're just going to space because. They explain it as they are using it for spice mining, which helps navigators like have visions and perceive safe travel routes throughout the stars. So it makes space travel a lot more possible. It makes it more, what is the word I am thinking of? Practical. It just makes it more practical because they have that perception of where they could be going. And that I find interesting in a space series, because usually like space is kind of just where they happen to be, but it's not always hugely integral to the story when it comes to movies similar to this. Like Star Wars, it's not like hugely integral that they're in space. You could technically do it all on one planet and they're just in different areas. They just happen to be in space. Whereas Dune, I think, takes a different approach, especially because, you know, Star Wars is kind of ripped off of Dune. But Dune focuses, like, why are they in space? Is there a reason they should be traveling to different planets? And they give a very specific reason. And it's usually, like, wherever the Empire sends them, it's for specific roles. It's like mining, war, faith, or whatever. They have very specific reasons for why they're doing space travel. And I find that detail to be appreciated because, you know, I kind of want a reason for where we are, or like, that doesn't always have to happen, but it should be like somewhat understandable. Why are they in space? Is there really a particular reason why they have to be in space, or are they just in space because, you know, space is cool? And so that little detail I liked. And I do kind of like that the story as well, they focus it mainly on a single planet. It is not like, it's not like Star Wars where they jump from planet to planet. They focus on Arrakis, the desert planet, because it's very integral to the Empire. They have to do spice mining, and there's kind of like a holy war that's going on. And so that is like a super interesting detail that I like. And it focuses very much on kind of like environmentalism, like all these foreigners are coming in here and destroying native land, similar to how colonialism does in the natural world. The real world is what I meant to say. Yeah, it's so natural to have colonialism. But that I find super interesting. So you discover how the Fremen are affected by the spice mining in the Empire, how they're hunted by the Harkonnens, and, you know, they're getting their land stolen. And then within their own cultures, they have missionaries from the Empire that are planting stories of like a Messiah and prophecies and saying, hey, they're going to come and it's going to be so-and-so. That is very, like, it's just a fascinating detail to add that, you know, you're not always going to experience that in stories like this, but there's such a massive narrative underlying of everything that they can use that to build the world. And I find that so interesting. And weirdly, the politics of it are kind of fascinating. And, you know, I'm not the biggest politics guy ever, but politics in this, I find it super interesting because you have this kind of faith group, the Bene Gesserit, that influence a lot of major political decisions. They have their own agenda, and, you know, they kind of have their own like powers and stuff that they are using to influence a lot of different things all at once. It's not just, okay, we have one prospect. They even say it several times throughout part 2 in particular, that they have several prospects that they're working on. If one doesn't play out, well, they got another way to get what they want. And that I find fascinating because it's just this like society that's underlying everything. And then you get more into how people are being ruled. Like the Harkonnens on Arrakis were very malevolent leaders. They arrived on the planet and they just start killing Fremen. They don't really like them. They don't like the natives. They are like, well, I'm here for my resources and you can piss off. That is your own problem. Whereas House Atreides, they are very much more benevolent rulers. They want to work with the Fremen. They do not want to impede on their rights. They are just like, hey, we're just here for resources and then we can leave you alone. Do whatever you want. And that is very similar to how the current world is. I feel like we have malevolent rulers and benevolent rulers where some are in it for their own gain, while some others are like, let's think more about a collective rather than just the individual. And that focuses especially in like their explanation of like the Empire versus the Fremen, because the Fremen are very much a collective. They are all very equal. There is not really a leader among them until Paul Atreides comes, because they believe he's the Lisan al-Gaib. Lisan al-Gaib? I think that's how I pronounced it. Maybe. I don't know. But it's just interesting to see the different political sides just within these two movies and find that, like, you know, one is driven very much on faith or community, while one is driven a lot more on power and wealth. And building a world with details like this that are very, very thought out, and they know how they want to use it, how to establish it, and what the effect is on the world of all these little details, that makes for a more interesting movie, in my opinion, because you are not being like, oh, this is basically Earth, but in space. They just establish completely different things. And, you know, that's super interesting. And I love that. And then with the second movie, they go much more into the story aspect of it all. And I think that's what we'll talk about next here, because the story, I think, is where it starts really kicking off. Because I was very intrigued with the first Dune movie. I'd never really heard about Dune or had seen anything of it. And it was just interesting. I was like, oh, okay. So like a Star Wars kind of looking thing. And then I learned that Dune is actually older than Star Wars, and I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. But the story, like in the first one, is sort of lackluster. Like, it's interesting, and I definitely was intrigued, but it's a slow build in that first one. They don't dive into much about the characters. They're like, well, Paul's kind of like the one figure, and some people believe him, some people don't, and that's kind of about it. That's like the major plot point in the first Dune, and so they're very much establishing the world. But then in the second one, they kind of focus a lot more about the dynamics between the characters. They start with like Paul and Jessica becoming one with the people. They have to become part of the Fremen, and find some commonality between them. And that's mainly with the war. There isn't really a war, but in almost a war against the Empire. They were sent there to be killed, essentially. And so they have this common ground of being like, hey, let's join together and we can, fight against the oppressors and, just connect more on things. And I find it interesting that Paul, especially, he focuses a lot more on becoming a part of the culture and not being a foreigner. He is very much like, okay, let's actually become part of the Fremen. And Jessica kind of is as well, but she's more focused on let's gain power among the Fremen. And that's just like super interesting. And like I said earlier, they believe that Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib, which is their term for like Messiah. And so within the Fremen, you have like the believers who are very much like, oh yeah, he's definitely the Messiah. And like everything he does, like Stilgar, like literally Paul breathes and he's like, Lisan al-Gaib, it's him, he's the Messiah. And it's kind of like a running joke throughout the film because just anything happens and he freaks out. He's like, he's the one. He is the chosen one. And that I find just hilarious. But you have people who are like very devout believers, and then you have the non-believers who are like, it's going to be Fremen who take back control and bring us out of this darkness. And it's kind of interesting because Paul does become one of the Fremen. He very much like, he joins the culture. He learns their ways. He's able to ride a sandworm, which is supposed to be something only the Fremen are allowed to do because like the sandworms allow it or whatever. And so that is just really interesting that there's these non-believers, but then he becomes one of the Fremen and then they start believing in him. And Jessica and Paul kind of go in this believing that Paul is the Messiah, but they do it very methodically because Paul doesn't come in being like, yes, I am the chosen one. He believes it, but the way he acts and connects with people, he acts like he doesn't. He's like, well, I'm not some big savior. I just want to learn your ways. And he's like very humble about it. But that fuels the belief of the believers because they now are like, well, only a Messiah could be as humble as that. And, he's going to save us, but he's not looking for glory out of it. And that's just so fascinating to me, because they've kind of implanted in their eyes, in their eyes and their minds, that Paul is the Messiah, but he doesn't want to be, or he's a worthy ruler. And it's interesting to see how they all eventually start to believe him. And as he learns their ways and he's able to do bigger and bigger things, he gains more power, and eventually he basically takes over. He drinks, I believe it's called the water of life. I don't remember the word they used for it. But for Jessica, she becomes their Reverend Mother, and drinking the water of life, she gets the memories of all of the previous Reverend Mothers until she passes on like that information with the Fremen. And men are not supposed to be able to handle it, but the Lisan al-Gaib is supposed to be able to. He's supposed, because the water of life is essentially poison. It's like blood of a sandworm, and it's supposed to be like poisonous. And so only a Reverend Mother should be able to overcome it. But Paul is able to, because he was raised in the ways of the Bene Gesserit, and with the help of Shandi, Zendaya's character, he comes out of it, and that further proves to everyone that, oh my gosh, he is the Messiah. He's able to do these impossible tasks, and that brings him to power. And then because of getting that power, Paul leads the Fremen, and, you know, we kind of switch where they're more community-based, but now they have someone to follow. It is not each other. It is a being. It's a person. It's a figurehead. And Paul leads them to bring the emperor and his daughter, then the leader of the Bene Gesserit, and bring them all to Arrakis and take over. Paul decides that he'll marry the princess and become the new emperor, and that throws off Shandi because she believes she's fallen in love with him, but it seems like it was his plan all along to take over and to gain all this power, even though he was saying that he didn't want it. And it's just so interesting, all these little tidbits that are played throughout the movie. And if you're like really, really paying attention, you start to notice them. And at the very end, you start thinking about it, and you're like, oh my gosh, they've been planning this from the beginning. Because you almost think that Paul has a change of mind where he's like, I don't really want to be the Messiah. But when he becomes it, he very much embraces it. And it's such like, it's almost like heart-wrenching, because you're like, oh, he's kind of fallen in love with the native, and, you know, he wants to be one of the people. And then he flips it, and he's like, I'm taking over. I will be in charge and will lead a new, more peaceful rule. And it's like, what? It's like they planned this the entire time. And if you're paying attention, of course they planned this. They talk about it at the very, very beginning of both movies, that he's just like destined for these specific things. But you kind of think it could change a little bit. And so just that progression and build up is awesome. And then combined with the cinematography of it all is magnificent. I'm a filmmaker, so I obviously notice a lot of these things, but I love how they focus on the emotional and spiritual aspects of the story through the cinematography. It is astounding, using sound and visuals to just amplify the way the emotion and spiritual aspects hit you. So let's start with like sound. So the music, especially, you notice a lot throughout the film. It's kind of like that. I'm trying to think of what's the best way to describe it. It's, I'm going to be honest, it's like desert chanting. If you think of like a desert movie and the like type choir music, almost like a single person that's singing, and the big musical, like instrumental type build up to it. That's the kind of music that plays, but it supports the narrative and it builds with the story. Every major impact of Paul, excuse me, becoming part of the Fremen goodness, I need some water. Every major point where Paul is becoming more and more impactful among the Fremen, the music builds. It shows that power behind him. It shows that he clearly is like he's supposed to be a chosen character. He's the one. He's the Lisan al-Gaib. And the music supports this, and the sounds throughout the film kind of amplify the world and the emotions that they're trying to tell. So you have some very like unique sounds, like the thumper is really interesting, that, you know, kind of leaves waves in the sand when it plays. You have the sandworms that have this weird kind of and like thumping sound that they make as well. And then anytime Paul has a vision, it's like this mix of images with the kind of sounds, and they're just used to portray some interesting aspects of the film, like using it for mystery. If you don't know what's happening, you get some kind of eerie music. You have sounds that are building up that provide a lot of intrigue. The music cuts out and you're only focusing on the sound. You have the power behind things like the sandworms, how they're just massive, massive creatures. And then like the cunning of the Fremen, of Paul, of the Harkonnen. And you just have all these aspects just being built with sound alone is astounding. And then you add the visuals on top of it, which, you know, the sound kind of adds to the vastness. And I didn't see it in IMAX, which I believe is probably the best way to view it, as I have been told. But the vastness of the world is so interesting, and the way they use it within the storytelling is interesting. Because, of course, you have the sandworms, which are huge. They're massive, massive creatures that are so wildly proportionally big. And then you have the massive desert, which is like the whole planet. And you have the power of belief, which is also massive. And that is something, it's kind of hard to capture on film. It's like, how do you capture belief? You can like have people say they believe something, but how do you really capture it? And the way they do it, especially with Paul being like the Lisan al-Gaib, they use him in contrast with the groups so much. Either him within it, where he is in something contrasting like a darker robe, or above the crowd. And you see just how massive these crowds are, and Paul is in the foreground, and so that makes him a bigger figure. Well, you have all these tiny subjects, and it's just an interesting way to visually portray belief. It adds to the narrative of like he's the spiritual being that is meant to come down and deliver them from darkness and liberate the planet and bring paradise back and make everything green again. And it's just so interesting to have visual aspects that reflect the story aspects. And I think that's what is so great about both of these movies, and it builds with both movies, because you kind of have a lot of the visual and sound aspects, and then you get into the character and spiritual aspects in the second one. And I think it's amazing. They are truly incredible movies. If you haven't seen them, go do it, because if you watch Dune, you are going to be easily entertained. So thank you for listening to this episode of Easily Entertained. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give us a follow so you can be notified of all the latest episodes. And before we go, we have two more parts of the video. One, we have our rating, which is our special Easily Entertained rating, because we enjoy everything, so we kind of have to mix it up instead of just a 1 to 10 scale. So going from least to worst, it's garbage, once is fine, you have the right mood, quotable, go to, and then all day, every day. And Dune, I would probably give, and once again, I'm going to combine both of them because, you know, I kind of think they're meant to be watched together. And they're not hugely standalone. It's a spectacle. You got to watch them both. And I would put it as go to, because like I said, the first one is very much exposition-y. There's not a lot of character development. I think it's important that they had that, because you need to establish what the world is instead of just throwing us in and being like, I have no idea what the heck is happening. But because of that, it does kind of suffer from some pacing issues, because the second movie very much like it flies through it, whereas the first one, it kind of is a slower burn. And both movies are very long. They are, I think the first one is 2.5, second one is 2:45. So they are kind of long movies. They're interesting and they're very visually appealing, but they are longer movies. And so you have to dedicate a lot more time to watch them. So with that being said, I would say it's more of a go-to rather than an all-day, every day. But, you know, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you would rate the Dune movies on a easily entertained scale. And then before we go, here is our question of the week. This is kind of a fun one based on the world of Dune. It is, would you dare to ride a sandworm? Would you want to become one of the Fremen and try riding one? Or is the concept of those massive creatures that could very easily kill you and, you know, bury you in the sand too terrifying? And I personally, I do think I would try. I would want to become a Fremen and try and ride a sandworm. Do I think I would make it and live? Yeah, probably not. But I would try to ride one because I think that would just be fun. But yeah, please answer our question of the week either in the comments on YouTube, on Spotify, Instagram, wherever. Just let us know, would you dare to ride a sandworm? And with that, that is the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next week for the next episode. Bye. You have been easily entertained.